Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We are moving on to the end of the war. Last week, we were talking about the turning points of the war, specifically surrounding emancipation, and then, of course, in the readings, we talked about battles, things like Gettysburg and Vicksburg and all of that. So, the turning point happens in 1863, and at that point, it's all a big downhill slide for the Confederacy. And so today, I'm calling this little talk the fall of the Confederacy, the end of the war, basically the last 2 years. In doing so, we're going to recap last week's material just a little bit, and then we're going to move on to the last 2 years of the war, 1864, 1865, talking about how this war ended and what came after. So, to get started, we talked about turning points. And last week was all about the turning points, and it's hard to emphasize how important the changing of war aims was in the war, because moving the war away from just a simple war to restore the Union or to maintain the Union towards a war that is going to free the slaves, that is a momentous moral change. And it wasn't welcome by all you Northerners, of course. But it was welcomed, surprisingly, by a lot of the people that were actually doing the fighting themselves. Back home in the North, a lot of people might have disagreed. You might have people that are making the argument about, black people are still inherently inferior. So, they're going to have the debate up north about what does emancipation mean? Are they going to be politically equal? All the stuff that I talked about in last week's lecture about emancipation, abolitionism, the splits within abolitionism, that stuff is still happening in the North. In the Union Army, though, there's something different happening. There are still some soldiers who, when Lincoln announces that this war is going to be fought to end slavery, there are going to be some soldiers in the war effort that don't like that are going to make the same arguments about slavery and genetic inferiority, racial inferiority, whatever it is. But those folks are actually going to end up, I don't know, we don't have a number value, of course, because, there were a lot of soldiers around. We don't know exactly who was who, but those folks are going to become fewer and fewer as time goes on. Because what happens is, as Union soldiers start marching through the South, and they start marching across plantations, and they start seeing the lives that slaves lived. They start seeing the shacks with the wooden floors. They start seeing the poor clothing as they come across slaves. They see the whipping posts. They see slaves being beaten in front of them. When Union soldiers encounter slavery, this, in the words of one soldier from Wisconsin, basically radicalized the Union Army. Union soldiers became very sympathetic and very angry. They became sympathetic to slaves and became very angry at the institution of slavery. And so when Lincoln announced that this war is going to become a war for freeing the slaves, a lot of Union soldiers approved of that and accepted that and embraced it as their own personal war aims, because a lot of people recognized maintaining the Union while allowing slavery to continue to exist is a recipe for failure. Slavery is what caused secession and the Civil War in the first place. If we drag the South back into the Union, but we don't eradicate slavery, we're just kicking that can down the road, and in a few years, it's all going to happen all over again, because eventually Southerners are going to get ticked off again, and they're going to secede, and basically the whole Civil War was fought for nothing if that happens. And so the recognition that slavery as an issue has to be eliminated after the war is over if we want to actually maintain the facade of having the Union. So we've got basically a moral issue here combined with a practical issue here. The moral, freeing the slaves, and the practical, slavery was the thing that ruined the country in the first place. We can't allow it to continue. Those two things came together under the Emancipation Proclamation, and that changed the nature of the war. Because Southerners now had to respond to that. Southerners now became the side that embraces slavery. And if you remember last week, I showed that map of the world where all of the places slavery was becoming illegal. Slavery was dying around the world. And so if you want to maintain good relations with the rest of the world, you can't be the society that embraces slavery. And so the Confederacy may have hoped that the British or somebody would join their side. They were wrong, because the British were very abolitionist. They were very anti-slavery. And so when the Emancipation Proclamation comes out, that puts Southerners as the party of slavery, the side of slavery. That's going to ruin their chances for international recognition and international aid through the last years of the war. So emancipation was a far-reaching change to the war. We tend to be cynical about it because it didn't affect slavery where the Union had no control, and so realistically the proclamation didn't really do much. It was more symbolic than anything, and the symbolism was important because it changed the nature of the war. Okay, so that's a major turning point. On the battlefield, of course, we've got the Vicksburg and the Gettysburg victories for the Union, and that can't be overstated. The first 2 years of the war, as we've talked about, were failures for the Union Army under George McClellan. The Union Army just kept getting annihilated and kept getting smacked around by Southerners. These two victories showed that the Union forces could pull their act together and successfully repel Southerners in two ways. One, Vicksburg, we could put one of their strongest strongholds under siege and eventually capture it and destroy it. And in Gettysburg, we could stop an advancing Confederate invasion of Northern Territory. So we could do two things as a result of this combination of battles. One, protect and stop Confederate advances at Gettysburg, and at Vicksburg, conquer their strongholds, their strong points. The most heavily fortified parts of the Confederacy was open to attack. If we could take Vicksburg, from the Union perspective, if we could take Vicksburg, we can take anything. It might take a long time. Vicksburg took a long time. As you can see here, that campaign took a month, give or take, more than a month. And it was very costly, but it happened. Gettysburg was only a few days, but again, it did what the Union needed to do. They needed to show that we could stop the movement of Confederate forces. And so, those two battles kind of reinvigorated the Union military effort. So now they've got kind of a moral argument to make, a moral cause to make, and a cause is very important. So we've got a moral cause, but we also now have kind of a couple of really strong victories. And so that boosts morale, and that helps the Union Army kind of turn their fortunes around. It also helps, of course, that, that Ulysses S. Grant, the guy that led the Vicksburg campaign, was sent back east to take over the entire Union Army. McClellan got booted out, and Grant was able to basically use the massive military that McClellan had successfully built. McClellan deserves credit for that. But Grant was able to take this massive army and was able to put it to good use. And so once Grant became in charge of the military, he was able to basically put together all of the military advantages that the Union enjoyed, that I mentioned, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, when I was talking about all the various advantages that the North and South brought to the conflict. The Union had a lot of advantages, and Grant was finally able to put those into action in a way that McClellan and others had been resistant to do. So we've got 1863 is the turning point, and once the Union passes that obstacle, I'm not sure if my analogy holds up, but whatever. Once the Union succeeds at conquering Vicksburg and repelling the invasion, then it's looking like, okay, maybe we finally have our act together, and hopefully we can now draw this thing to a close. And in the middle of all of this, strangely enough, the U.S. government decided to hold an election. It wasn't on a whim. This was the 4 years of election, and so this experiment in democracy did not get shut down during the war. I mean, you would think that at any time in U.S. history, the most likely time for an election to get suspended would be in the middle of a civil war. We've got Americans fighting Americans, but no, it didn't. The election of 1864 went on as planned. There was a Democratic candidate. The Democrats grabbed McClellan, that general that just got booted out of the Union Army. Didn't get booted, but demoted and transferred. The Democrats he became the Democratic candidate in 1864, and of course the Republicans kept Lincoln. And we had an actual campaign, political campaign, At the same time, we've got all those military campaigns going on. And so here we've got a couple of election posters. On the left, you've got the McClellan side, and over on the right, you've got the Lincoln side talking about the things that would happen if the other side won. So from the McClellan perspective, if Lincoln wins, then we've got drafts, we've got anarchy, we've got ruin, Negro equality, debt, harder times. Whereas if you elect McClellan, we'll have peace and union and all of that. On the other side of the prediction of electing McClellan will bring about an armistice, falling wages, no market for produce. I'm not quite sure what that means because the Confederacy needs vegetables too, but whatever. Pennsylvania is a border state, invasion, civil war, anarchy, despotism, the end. It's still kind of apocalyptic rhetoric, which you would expect in the middle of a civil war. But the amazing thing is that you actually have a political campaign happening. And for a while, things didn't look so good for Mr. Lincoln. Lincoln, by 1864, had, the military effort had turned around with Gettysburg and Vicksburg and all of that, but a lot of people expected Lincoln to probably lose. There were a whole lot of Union soldiers out there. Many of them were draftees who were being forced to fight against their will. They get to vote. The families of those draftees get to vote. And so a lot of people believed that Lincoln was going to actually lose this election. And to the point where Lincoln actually proclaimed admitted that he was having nightmares about losing the White House in after the 1864 election. This cartoon is kind of showing Lincoln's dream, where you've got Lady Liberty chasing Lincoln. Lincoln is this guy over here on the left running away. The Lady Liberty chasing him out the door while throwing the head of a slave at him while McClellan walks into the White House behind him. So there's this fear that Lincoln had that he was not going to win the war. And there was a lot of fear of what's going to happen, because if McClellan wins, then we might have some of this stuff happens where suddenly, if McClellan wins, he's probably just going to end the war, probably going to let the Southerners secede, and all of the pain that the Union had gone through, or the Northerners had gone through, would be just cast aside because McClellan would just give up. And so there was some real fear about what would happen. We know now, of course, that fear was kind of misplaced. Lincoln actually sailed to a fairly easy victory in 1864, kind of surprisingly. Surprisingly, one of the reasons that he won was because of the military vote. Because it turned out the Union military went predominantly for Lincoln. A lot of people had expected they would go for McClellan because he had been their commander, and under McClellan's command, they weren't put into danger very often, and so a lot of people thought McClellan would be able to easily win the Union Army vote. But no, it turns out that the Union Army went for Lincoln. And there's been a lot of conjecture among historians that a lot of that was probably, like I said, Union soldiers had become radicalized when they came into contact with slavery in the South. Those Union soldiers, many of whom had never even seen a black person before, they'd been indoctrinated in all the racial stereotypes of the time, but they had never actually met a black person anywhere. And suddenly, when they're marching through southern plantations, they did come into contact with black people. And when they realized black people are people, what a thought, then suddenly this became more real to them. And so, again, you can't overstate the impact of that radicalization of the Union military once they came into contact with slavery. And they overwhelmingly voted for Lincoln. Because, again, he's the one pushing this moral aspect of the war. So, as we can see here, popular vote, he got 55% to 45%. In political terms, that's a landslide. But electoral vote, he got 91% of the electoral votes. Not even close there. So Lincoln wins election easily. And so this is in November of 1864. He gets inaugurated in March of 1865. By March of 1865, the writing is on the wall for all the reasons I'm going to talk about here in just a second. But Lincoln had cause in March of 1865 to give his second inaugural address. Now, we remember from a couple weeks ago when I was talking about his first inaugural address, I was talking about kind of quoting various parts of the speech where he was kind of being antagonistic towards Southerners. Talking about, hey, look, I'm not going to mess with you, but if you mess with me, this is on you. This is going to be your fault, my fellow countrymen, and not mine. I'm going to sleep soundly at night. You're the ones that are going to cause trouble here. In the second inaugural address, he's much more of a peacemaker, as we will see in just a second. This is a drawing of him at his second inaugural address. This is a shot of the crowd, and supposedly, if you look very closely, somewhere here in the crowd, you'll see a well-known actor named John Wilkes Booth, who will become important to our story a little bit later. Maybe you can see him better in this picture. It's always been kind of debatable. Historians don't really agree. There's been people that have found faces in the crowd that look like him, and John Wilkes Booth claimed that he was in this crowd at some point. So anyway, we don't really care about that for now. But this is just a shot of Lincoln giving his inaugural address, and this is him standing up here giving his speech. And in that second inaugural address, one of the more famous lines, or the most famous sections, is this. I mean, it was a very short speech to begin with. It was only like 5 minutes long, but this paragraph is the one that stands out to everybody. Because this is going to be his perspective on what do we do when the war is over. So, we've got that with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So we need to carry forward, we need to wrap this up, we need to finish the war, but we need to do this with malice toward none, with hatred toward none. We need to bind up the nation's wounds. We need to build a lasting peace with the people that are going to be on the losing side of this conflict. That attitude is going to cause some heartburn for Northerners, which we will talk about next week when we get to Reconstruction. But for now, let's end this part with this kind of idea that Lincoln recognized that the war is over, almost over, and he's looking ahead to the future where Northerners and Southerners have to come back together, sit down together, and build a new country again. And he's trying to kind of set the stage for that here by saying, with malice towards none, with charity towards all, we need to be resolved to work with our wayward brethren. Bind up the nation's wounds. We must achieve a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So he's talking about how we need to rebuild a country where we all get together. But more to come on that. Let's talk about the end of the military war here. So when Lincoln felt like he was on the verge of collapse in the political campaign, he had basically let Grant and Sherman off the leash. Basically told them that, what, I may not survive this political contest, so we need to wrap this up before I'm out of office. Because if we don't, and I lose, McClellan's going to come in here and he's going to give away the farm. So, generals, go do your thing. And in late 1864, William Sherman, one of Grant's right-hand man, came up with the idea of let's go take the war to the people. And this is going to be the idea of what became known as Sherman's March to the Sea, where in the summer of 1864, he's going to basically break off from Grant's Union Army and just march across Georgia and just lay waste to everything he can see. At one point, he called it, I want to share the hard hand of war with Southerners, with the Confederates. Because Grant and Sherman embraced this new vision of warfare, where you don't just fight against armies, you're going to fight against societies. In this new technological world we live in, where the home front is supplying weapons and guns and clothes and food and all of that to an army, in order to end the conflict, you have to take the fight to the civilians also. And so Sherman's March was built on the idea that we have to take the war to the civilians. The civilians are the ones that are propping this military effort up. They're the civilians that voted for secession. The civilians are the ones that need to understand just what war means. And so the March to the Sea was Sherman's army cut a 50-mile wide gash through Georgia, captured the city of Savannah. Soon after the presidential election, he sent a telegram to Lincoln, congratulating him on winning the election and also offering the city of Savannah as a Christmas present in 1865. And then Sherman turned to the north and just kept marched across South Carolina, up into North Carolina, and eventually just laying waste to everything they see. Southerners were livid. This was not the seemly form of warfare that they proclaimed they wanted to fight for. He had said at one point that Sherman had said that he wanted to make Georgia howl, and he certainly did. Georgia still still hates Sherman. His name is still not welcome in Georgia. But they just laid waste to everything they see. Burned down villages, they destroyed, crops. They destroyed all the livestock they came across. They destroyed towns. They destroyed Atlanta burned. And so it was just a way to make civilians understand the cost of this war. And they succeeded. Southerners were utterly demoralized. They were angry, but also demoralized because they weren't able to stop this. Because remember, all those Union advantages that I talked about were fully in play at this point. The higher number of soldiers, the better supplies. The Union military was pretty much able to go wherever it wanted in the Confederacy at this point, and Confederates really couldn't stop it. As we see here, there was kind of this dancing around where Confederate armies kept attacking, but then retreating. The dotted line means it was retreating, and so basically the Confederates just kept having to, they would attack, get beaten, and then would retreat further on. And then finally in April of 1865, the military commander in this region surrendered to Sherman. So, again, Lincoln had done this as a way to try to wrap up the war. It didn't wrap up the war, but it did accelerate things a bit, because what this helped to do was to sever more parts of the Confederacy. And so what this map is showing change over time. Back in 1861, you've got the lightest pink here, and the entire Confederacy was controlled by the Confederacy. Then in 1863, the Union managed to take Vicksburg, and cut a path through the Confederacy along the Mississippi River. And so that cut the Confederacy into two. You've got Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas over here on the west, everybody here over on the east, but the Confederacy's cut in two. That causes problems for the Confederacy. Sherman's march to the sea cuts another gash through the Confederacy, and after the conquest of Savannah, the Confederacy has now been cut into three parts. And at that point, the writing is pretty much on the wall that the Confederacy is not going to survive this. The Union is now employing all of its advantages. The Confederacy has been cut into thirds, and there's not much chance of a victory at that point. No matter how good a General Robert E. Lee is, or any of his lieutenants, they're not going to be able to pull this off. Once Sherman cuts another hole in the Confederate territory, it's pretty much over. And we can see that out on the remaining theater of war, the Virginia territory, Virginia, North Carolina, and all of that. As we just saw in the last slide, Sherman's troops are marching through South Carolina to North Carolina. So the southern part of this group is being taken, being kept busy by Sherman. Up here in the northern part, this is where Grant is facing off against Lee. And after Gettysburg, Lee had been retreating back into the South. Grant chased after him, and the last 2 years of the war are basically this cat and mouse game where Lee is on the run for a year and a half, 2 years, while Grant is chasing after him very closely behind him. And so we have this dance going throughout Virginia, where we're starting off in the Wilderness Campaign in May of 1864, and then we're just going on down the line. Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania Courthouse, North Anna, Cold Harbor, all of these famous battles where Grant would catch up with Lee. Lee would dig in to repel Grant's attack. Grant would eventually push through. Lee would run. And then they would set it all up again. And so we have this campaign kind of happening throughout the South here, throughout Virginia, where Grant and Lee are just playing cat and mouse. And Lee is losing people, soldiers left and right. Grant's losing people left and right too, but Grant has a lot more people to start with. And so no matter how the attrition goes, Grant keeps coming out ahead. And so for the last year of the war, give or take, between the Wilderness in May of 64 and Appomattox in April of 65, there's just basically this constant movement where Lee is running, Grant catches up, attacks, Lee runs, Grant catches up, attacks. And even to the point where eventually Lee is so worn down that the appearance of another army coming in from the west, the northwest, Lee has no choice but to surrender in April of 65 at Appomattox Courthouse. And with the surrender of Lee, the war's not over. There's still other Confederate generals out there leading armies, but Lee was the spiritual head of the Confederate military. And when Lee surrenders, the writing is on the wall. The Confederacy's been, severed into thirds by this point. And when Lee surrenders, the game is over. The Confederacy, folds pretty quickly, thereafter, which brings an end to the conflict. Now, this makes it sound like it was easy for the Union. I mean, the Union and the Confederates, there's still, tens of thousands of dead accumulating in these last stands of the Civil War. So it was very bloody, but it was also pretty inevitable because, again, Grant was able to use all those advantages that we mentioned a couple weeks ago that the Union always had, but previous commanders had not exploited. Okay. So, the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about the lasting effects of the Civil War on North and South. Just as a preview of things to come, I mean, the effects on the South were dramatic. I mean, the South was in ruins. They lost 26% of their fighting age young men, with lots of civilians dead. I mean, as we're going to see here, there's lots and lots of destruction of cities throughout the South. Richmond, Virginia was in ruins. This was the capital of the Confederacy for most of the war. Richmond was destroyed. We've got Charleston, South Carolina, Atlanta, Columbia, South Carolina. The evacuation of Richmond. And Richmond, the capital, and various major cities of the South were in ruins at the end of the war. So, inflation in the thousands, the political power being destroyed because an entire generation of military and political leaders were wiped out. We'll talk more about that next week. Land and resource destruction and the lost cause. The lost cause in many ways is the most lamentable legacy of the Civil War. We'll talk more about that over the next couple of weeks. The effects on the North were not nearly as traumatic, as you can probably imagine. The vast majority of warfare had happened in Confederate territory. The only Union sites that were affected during the war were Gettysburg and briefly at Antietam. And those two battles were very deadly, very dramatic. However, they were very limited in scope. And so the Union territory was intact during the war and after the war. And so the Union obviously is going to enjoy many advantages because of that. There's going to be some inflation, but not nearly as much as in the South. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The Union lost about 14% of its, fighting age young men in the war compared to the Southerners, 26%. So it was, it's those numbers. It's in sheer volume, 360,000 dead soldiers and 260,000 dead Confederate soldiers. That's nothing to, that's bad. That's amazingly bloody. But the North wasn't affected nearly as much as the South was. And that's going to have some important consequences. Politically, just as an example, when all those Confederates left Congress and went off, back to Richmond or whatever, that left behind Republicans, Northerners. And those Northerners and those Republicans used that time in Congress to basically put through all of the Republicans' dreams. And back in those days, Republicans were the party of big government. They were not the conservative party that we have today. They were the opposite. They were the Democrats of their time. And they wanted to make a lot of changes. They wanted to create new systems. Clay's American system is where we create a large federal government that's going to fund things like roads, railroads, telegraph, canals. The government is going to be involved in a lot more areas of life than had happened before the war. A lot of times, Republicans' ideas about expanding the size of government had always been stymied by by Southern conservatives. Southern conservatives all left, so now the Republicans are able to get all the stuff they want. So they start building universities, they start building railroads, they start changing the laws about citizenship, which we'll talk about next time. And so the Republicans in Congress, who were left behind once the Confederates left, are able to put through a lot of stuff they were never able to put through before. And so after the Civil War, we have a much more activist federal government than had ever existed before in American history. And that's going to be important when we get to things like Reconstruction and, the Progressive Era and the New Deal and all of that too. That all gets a precedent during the Civil War. Of course, Lincoln's death is one of the, the traumatic ending to the war. Lincoln, of course, had been the guy that had, captained the ship of state through stormy waters, or whatever analogy you want to use, and his death sparked turmoil. I mean, it was, this was traumatic, for Union, but, Confederates were also kind of shocked by this also. I'm not going to go into the details about the assassination and all of that, but the thing that we have to keep in mind is that Lincoln was the guy at the end of the Civil War. He'd been the one that won, the guy that won the war. He was the idea man. He had put through emancipation. His death throws everything into turmoil because as, in the wake of his death, there's a big political void there that a lot of people are going to jump in to try to fill that void. And so when we get to Reconstruction next week, we're going to be talking about the turmoil of all these different factions trying to, guide the country in the wake of the Civil War. Lincoln's death leaves a massive void that has to be filled by someone. And who's going to fill it? That's going to be a whole nother political battle. And so Reconstruction is going to be this 12-year-long battle between different factions trying to fill the void that Lincoln left behind. But again, that's coming attractions. Other legacies that we will touch on a little bit over the next couple of weeks. This was a war over slavery. It was not a war over states' rights. Afterwards, as we will see, a lot of Confederates are going to claim afterwards that, no, we were not fighting over slavery. We were fighting over principles like states' rights and all of that. That stuff comes after the war. It doesn't come before the war. That's an attempt to kind of whitewash the, literally whitewash the war itself. So anyway, we'll hear about this fight over states' rights versus slavery. In the past, before the Civil War, when people would say the United States, they would always phrase it as the United States are doing this. The United States are going to go to war with Mexico. The United States are funding railroads in Kansas. After the war is over, that terminology changes to the United States is. And that's important. I mean, that's, it might be a small thing from a grammatical standpoint, but from a symbolic standpoint, that's very important because in the past that meant United States are. That means it's a bunch of small organizations working together towards some greater cause. When you change it to the United States is, that means you've got one conglomerate group doing one thing. There is no, group of states working together. It is now a national government. And so, there's a national government that existed that did not exist before the war. Before the war, people still thought of states as being supreme in some ways. Constitution, putting that aside. But after the war, that was not the case anymore. The United States is an entity, a solid entity that is going to do a thing all collectively. The Northern vision is going to triumph over the Southern, obviously. They triumphed militarily. They're going to triumph economically and all of that too, which we shall see. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's a much larger central government at this point that's going to do a lot of big government type things. Direct taxation, creating a national currency, national welfare agencies. A lot of the perspective of government that we have today, that government is a large entity that will tackle social problems, that is a consequence of the Civil War. And we'll see how and why over the next week or two. So that's where we are. So have a good week, and I hope this was helpful, and I will see you all online. Take care.